Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas shaping and defending our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo, and this week I have the privilege to sit down with Dr. Marion Messmer. Dr. Messmer is a senior research fellow at Chatham House, a premier think tank located in the United Kingdom in London. Prior to that, she studied at Cambridge as well as King's College, has a strong background in nuclear issues, was co-director of BASIC, which is the British American Security Information Council, and is the author of a new report, which we'll go into today. Dr. Messmer, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I thought maybe we'd start with, you just came out with this report, Cybersecurity of the Civil Nuclear Sector, and I thought maybe we can kick off with a little bit of a summary of the report, some of your key findings, and also what led you to work on this particular effort.
Yeah, absolutely. So this report for us brings together a few different strands of work that we've been working on for quite a few years now. So the cybersecurity specifically of nuclear power plants is something that's been really important for us at Chatham House for a long time. So we started working on that as a team back in 2014 and spent some time with the nuclear power sector in the UK and with the IAEA working on these topics in sort of 2014 to 2016. We then checked in on it again in 2019 and did some work where we looked at what we can learn from the insurance sector around insuring against cyber attacks, because that was a new topic that was coming in at the time. And then because the IAEA also had actually led such a huge effort on making sure to build capacity for cybersecurity globally on this, we thought it was a good time to kind of check in again where we had got to, not just in the UK, but also globally, because at the same time, there was this other trend of a huge increase in cyber attacks, specifically on critical national infrastructure, which nuclear power is for a lot of countries. So what we wanted to do in this report was, first of all, assess what the threat landscape is like now from a cybersecurity perspective for nuclear infrastructure specifically. We also wanted to look at what international law does in order to protect this really important sector, because there has been a lot of attention on that side of things because of the Russian attacks on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine. And then finally, we wanted to look at what more could be done to ensure the cybersecurity and whether there was anything about the technological changes that we are seeing approaching in the sector through things like the wider spread of AI and things like the advent of different types of reactors. Because, you know, if we compare the sort of traditional nuclear power sector, we've got nuclear power plant design that in some cases predates the internet, but then we also have new reactor types like small modular reactors or micro reactors that may not be widely distributed at this point, but the whole purpose of them is that they will all be networked and that they can be operated remotely. So some of the traditional cybersecurity techniques that you might be using, like air gapping and so on, is all of a sudden not so straightforward anymore when you have a reactor where the whole selling point is that it can be operated remotely without having staff on site. So those were some of the issues that were driving us to look into this and that we wanted to address in the report.
Marion, thank you for an excellent summary. And I would question if we could ever completely air gap anything in the cyber domain, but clearly, when you're looking at the advent of small modular reactors, micro, and you're seeing the same thing play out in other energy sectors with microgrids and the like, these obviously are designed at a different time and do bring about new risk, new opportunity and efficiency, and including for climate and the like, but also new security risks. And what I thought maybe you could do is start looking at what you saw the primary threats faced to this sector. And again, I think we're talking here civilian in particular, but there's been a growth. So I'd be curious what some of your initial findings were.
Yeah, absolutely. And we broke this threat analysis down basically into peacetime and then conflict. And this was in part inspired, as I said, by what we have been seeing Russia do around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, but also because of this forward look and looking at the potential that small modular reactors and microreactors bring for a lot of regions of the world, that are suffering from conflicts at the moment, which means that if these reactor types spread, then what we're seeing now in Zaporizhzhia, while it's not a completely unique or never before seen situation, it is pretty rare that a nuclear power plant is caught up in war fighting in that way. But it's something that we might actually see much more frequently in the future, which is why we thought it was important to look at these issues separately. But even in peacetime, we have seen perhaps like a slight shift in the threat landscape. Mm-hmm. In part, that's because that there has been a rise of cyber criminals that like to target specifically critical national infrastructure, which nuclear power is for a lot of countries. And so that means that you have a range of threats facing nuclear infrastructure in that regard. So you have criminal actors that might want to extort a government or want to extort an operator, that almost don't necessarily care about the fact that it's a nuclear power plant. They just care that it's critical national infrastructure, and in that sense, that poses a risk in the same way that perhaps health infrastructure might be at risk, or other types of energy infrastructure. But then, of course, you have also the additional sensitivity that there is a risk involved with nuclear reactors. Not the same for all reactor types, but when people hear nuclear power, many of them think of Chernobyl and those kinds of nuclear accidents. And there is, of course, always the risk that there could be an accident that leads to the release of radiation, or that might lead to the theft of nuclear materials. So in that sense, you have to be extra careful just to make sure that you mitigate against those kinds of risks as well. And then you have the other sort of perhaps threat vector of someone targeting personnel that works in a power plant against again, either in order to extort or to coerce. So there are these different slices of threats that emerge. And then, of course, given the geopolitical environment, we have also seen over time that hostile governments might want to target nuclear power plants either as critical infrastructure or just as a way of attacking something that is really important to a government. For example, we've seen this in South Korea, where North Korean hackers targeted some of the energy infrastructure there. So in broad strokes, those are the kind of threats that we see. But then, of course, there is the sort of inadvertent or accidental threat landscape as well, where you might just have some sort of a bug out there, some sort of a virus or worm that isn't necessarily targeting a nuclear power plant as such, but perhaps the power plant uses software that is susceptible to that kind of attack, and therefore there's a vulnerability there that can be exploited. And I think, while we have got a lot better at sort of thinking of the purposeful kinds of risks that are out there, something that we're not always thinking through is where the inadvertent vulnerabilities might be coming from, and how you can also protect from those kind of attacks.
Marion, that's a great point, and very apropos given the CrowdStrike news. So sometimes it may not even be malicious at all. It may be intended to be a patch that can have unintended consequences. And I do want to talk about the software sets of issues momentarily, but I think you raised a really important point. Some countries are in it for espionage, to enhance some of their nuclear aspirations, goals, capabilities. Think North Korea, think Iran, think others. But we are seeing, and I think you framed it in a very good way, peacetime, wartime. I kind of have a hard time discerning the two sometimes these days, yeah. And cyber extends the battlefield to incorporate all of society. But all that said and done, from the U.S. perspective, Volt Typhoon was a big wake-up call where China was doing nothing, no benefit for espionage or even traditional reconnaissance, but intelligence preparation of the battlefield, and have a foothold into our critical infrastructure. So that is part of what this broader set of issues looks like, right? Any cases in particular that we've seen thus far that we can discuss publicly that drew concern and attention from your perspective. And clearly, this sector is unique. It is the nuclear sector, and yes, we all come to that maybe from a different perspective than some of the other critical infrastructure sectors. But any cases in particular rise to the level of concern from your perspective?
Well, there are a few different ones for different reasons, right? And the other thing I would point out also is that we found that there's sometimes a huge time lag between when an attack might occur and when you actually hear about it, specifically in the sector, because both operators and governments can be quite worried about what it means releasing news of such an attack. But I would say it's actually really important to have that greater deal of transparency, which is, in terms of our conversation, is probably jumping several steps ahead, because that's getting to what kind of recommendations we make in our report.
And we will get there, because the recommendations are key. Yep.
Yeah, but that was something that was just really interesting to me, because we were speaking with some people who do a lot of cybersecurity in the financial sector, which is also a sector that can be really worried about being too transparent, or perhaps losing some of its privacy, because they might have client concerns around privacy and so on. But what the finance sector, at least in the UK, found was that actually, if you have a sort of notification system where you let each other know when a hack occurred or when an attack occurred, it can help everyone, because a competitor might have a similar vulnerability, and if you let them know this time around, then maybe next time, if they pick up on something early, they will let you know in turn. And so I think this is something that could also be really beneficial for the nuclear power sector. But just to go back to your question about what kind of attacks have we seen that are particularly notable in this space, it's now a few years old, but I think something that always comes up and that remains notable is the Stuxnet attack on Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities, just because it's one of the unique cases where we actually see a cyber attack having physical consequences. And that's something that doesn't happen all that often, and, was very carefully engineered in this case, but it is important in the sense that it's something that we have now seen can happen. So it's a risk that we need to be prepared for and to protect against. And then I think the other case that really stuck in my mind is the one that I already mentioned, which is also actually from a decade ago now, the 2014 North Korean attack on the South Korean grid, because one of the avenues that they took in that attack was that they purposefully wanted to frighten the Korean population as well, and sort of stoke fear of whether there might have been nuclear radiation release, none of which happened, right? I think they even just got access to HR data, which is of course important and significant, because it might put the staff at the power plant at risk, but it's obviously less significant than in terms of radiation release, is a lot less significant than if they actually were able to control the reactor, or, get access to control software, that sort of thing. But I thought that was really interesting, because they used the fact of having done that attack in a way to then also add an additional layer of psychological warfare, almost, where they kind of used it to blackmail or frighten. And then I think the other thing that has really stuck in my mind is the huge increase of cyber attacks, not on a particular national grid or operator or whatever it might be, but actually attacks on the International Atomic Energy Agency, because that's a body, that you would think is as benign as they can get. All the IAEA is trying to do is coordinate its member states, making sure that people have access to best practice guidance, build capacity, and provide safeguards for nuclear materials. But we've also seen a huge increase of attacks on them, which can inhibit how they do their work. So that says something about perhaps the motivations of cyber criminals that execute these attacks, and also perhaps about the state of the international system and the state of multilateralism, that the IAEA has become a target of attack in that sense. So these are all very different types of attacks that happened at very different times, but I think they all say something about the threat landscape that we are in at the moment, and what kind of risks governments and operators have to be ready to defend themselves against.
You frame that very well. And attacks you see in other sectors can obviously have implications in nuclear, and clearly you blink and you miss the hack du jour. So, and to your point, in terms of ransomware, it really has democratized the threat, agnostic to the targets, but we're seeing hospitals impacted that have life-death consequences, just as nuclear would. We also just had Michael Barnhart on from Mandiant. He talked about a particular threat actor, APT-45, which has extensively been targeting the nuclear reactors and sectors in India. So buckle up. I unfortunately think there are going to be more, and I think IT/OT, that's sort of a big issue. We tend to think of cybersecurity as the geeks behind the keyboards alone, and then physical security. But the reality is technology has a vote in this, and the bad guys have a vote in this. And I'm having a harder time discerning the difference between IT/OT, because it is converging, and it's converging fast, and often for very good reasons, efficiency and the like. But it also brings about new vulnerabilities we need to think about. I do want to pull on sort of the advent, as you highlighted, of small modular reactors, micro, and the like. What about startups? What should they be thinking? And do we have a good handle on the supply chain? That becomes a big issue. If ET's phoning home and it's inside your system, that could be an issue, right? So I'd be curious what some of your thoughts are there.
Absolutely. I mean, the supply chain issue is huge. And especially, I think at this point in time, it's an issue for both traditional power plants, but also for small modular reactors, of course, especially, because they are often built and designed by a much larger number of different actors, where you might have, the firm that does the initial design might outsource other aspects of design to other companies that specialize in it. But it also means that the more actors you've got involved in that design process, the less of a handle you actually have on who does what do different stacks look like. They might even have completely inadvertent vulnerabilities just because they're relying on a certain library that might be out of date or that might not be fully secure anymore. And I think we're also really seeing here the difference in commercial design standards versus design standards if someone is used to working on more sensitive technology, because a lot of startup culture is around building a product fast. But specifically when you're working with nuclear materials, and all nuclear reactors obviously have to go through a really rigorous certification process. But I think that there is a risk here that specifically the cybersecurity side of things might not get enough attention, because we've got a lot of regulation when it comes to the actual nuclear materials, but significantly less when it comes to the cybersecurity aspect. And, if you were in a situation where a subcontractor that's working on a software solution just isn't quite as used to, working with the level of sensitivity that you need to when you are working on something so critical, then that could introduce accidental vulnerabilities. And I think, we have seen some of that. The nuclear power sector is obviously a relatively mature sector at this point, and I think there's something that we can learn about the period of sort of retrofitting traditional nuclear power plants when different software solutions were introduced and when different industrial steering software, was introduced. Like at one point you had very bespoke systems and no one really thought about cybersecurity, because the idea was that these systems are so bespoke that there isn't necessarily going to be a risk here. But then over time, you ended up with these now very modern looking kind of different patchworks of IT solutions, where you might have some like HR software that talks to your intranet, that talks to something else. And it all of a sudden means that you are using quite a lot of off-the-shelf software. And that then means that you might be introducing vulnerabilities that you previously hadn't really thought about just because they are in that commercial software solution. But we now have quite a lot of guidance around how to operate in that. And I think the small modular reactor space gives us the opportunity to design with these principles in mind, as long as the startups understand that that is something that needs to happen, right?
Yeah.
And I think the IAEA has done a lot to try and put that guidance out there. And there are some companies that really try to work with that. But I think we do need to do a lot more to make sure that all the nuclear power startups that we're seeing actually want to embrace the existing best practice knowledge rather than sort of like distancing themselves from the existing sector, which is also something that can happen because of the sort of like public opinion part of it, right? That I mentioned earlier, where like some people just think of Chernobyl when they hear nuclear power. Mm-hmm. And so you see some startups that really want to put a huge amount of distance between themselves and that aspect of the sector.
Marion, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I mean, it also provides great opportunities to do things right. We've had this bolt-on effect with cybersecurity for years. A theme that's very near and dear to my institute and Auburn University is cyber-informed engineering, or baking security into the design of architectures, or secure by design, as the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS refers to it. I think we've got to take this beyond a good idea and make it real. So anything you can do to foot stomp all of that, please continue, because I think this, if you don't get it early, it's a lot harder to get after the fact. And I think there are some opportunities with new technologies that are being fielded. I just hope that that also becomes part of that broader supply chain discussion, and it's not purely a cost function. But an ounce, a penny here could save a whole lot there. Let's get into some of the recommendations and some of the international legal protections and challenges. And you underscored the importance of public-private partnerships, but I think it's somewhat similar in the UK, Europe, and elsewhere to the US, where nuclear is almost treated in its own silo, which has great advantages, but it also misses out on opportunities in being part of the broader ecosystem in terms of awareness and partnerships. What are some can you, if you can help us unpack the regime, the landscape that you see right now, and what some of your thoughts are there, that would be great.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one really big area is exactly what you address, more cooperation, even if it's just at an awareness raising level, where you bring people who work in the nuclear sector together with people who work on cybersecurity in other sectors, just for that exchange. Because the nuclear sector is so siloed, you sometimes get into this mindset that you have to start solving every problem from scratch. Mm-hmm. But especially when it comes to cybersecurity, there is so much best practice out there. And, as I mentioned, so much of the software is now off the shelf. So you could really benefit from looking at how other even very sensitive sectors have sort of arranged their cybersecurity practices, what they do in order to keep up to date, what kind of training they provide, what kind of risk management they've got. And there's a lot there that I would like to see a lot more of. I think there's also a lot of scope for international exchange on this. Mm-hmm. For example, between the US and the UK, there are already so many exchanges on so many
That's
other
pretty
issues.
Strong. Yeah.
So that why not also focus specifically on cybersecurity when it comes to nuclear power? And then I think the IAEA already provides so many good blueprints around this as well. But what we're seeing is that depending on the state, of course, but for some states there's quite a lot of gap between the best practice recommendation and then the implementation. Mm-hmm. So in some cases, you also see that a state might have a really good strategy, but then the strategy timeline, which is actually something that, is also the case for the UK, the timeline of implementation for the strategy is so long that you kind of wonder, isn't there a way to do that quicker, especially when it's for some very standard cybersecurity recommendations that we've kind of known about for years at this point. So, I think when it comes to public-private partnership, it's breaking out of these silos and then also seeing whether we can perhaps move a little quicker on some of the more common and sort of like very common sense approaches to cybersecurity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what about international law? I mean, you can see how various and existing, almost a patchwork of different laws, regulations, and the like can fit in this sector. But is there one overriding, or should there be one overriding? I don't want to say regime per se, but how would you see that legal framework playing out in terms of ensuring
Yeah,
the
I mean,
security?
the legal framework is also sort of a patchwork framework. There isn't one overarching principle or one overarching legal regime that covers nuclear power as such, but there are different aspects of international law that speak to it in different ways, and different principles that apply. So in our analysis, we found that, probably what exists is good enough. But part of the issue with international law is, of course, that there isn't one enforcement agency, or there isn't a sort of international police that makes sure that you follow the rules. So there's a lot of leeway up to states, and it relies on states' goodwill to actually follow the rules. And I think that we are going to see specifically issues around that when it comes to the question of nuclear reactors in conflict, because this is in part what inspired us to do that analysis, because there were various attempts to safeguard the Ukrainian nuclear power plants, and specifically the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, better. But at the end of the day, if Russia as the aggressor in that situation doesn't take the responsibility to self-regulate what they will and won't do around a nuclear power plant, then there's a limited amount that others can do other than call out and call for more responsible behavior and that sort of thing. So as I said initially, that's something that I personally worry we're actually going to see more of, because there is such a huge potential for small modular reactors to actually really change the game in terms of energy security, which is obviously hugely important. But at the same time, it also means that we might see nuclear reactors in environments where they do find themselves in an active combat zone or something similar like that.
Yeah, and you touch on an issue very near and dear to me, and I don't mean to pull you into this fully, but for a while here, we've been blaming victims, and you know what? Everyone should be doing more, but it's also putting some pain and ensuring imposition of cost and consequence on some of this bad behavior, and that's where I know it gets delicate, because cyber is its own thing, but it has to be seen in its entirety of diplomacy, statecraft, national security, military strategy, and the like. But I do think when I think nuclear, I think that would demand a response. Now, again, I think if you were to ask the average British or American citizen, they would think so too. But obviously, it's a little more nuanced. And the question I have is, what's lacking in any of this, if anything? Or is it more how to translate nouns into verbs, how to enforce some of this? What are some of your thoughts there?
I think enforcement is missing. And then the other really big challenge, where I'm not sure how we can do better to address it, is that so much of the international system only works when you've got a consensus around it. And what we are unfortunately seeing at the moment is that consensus is breaking up, or at the very least weakening quite significantly. And some of the actors who we really need on side to enforce some of this are some of the ones who we see also weakening the system. I already mentioned Russia, and I think they are doing quite a lot to undermine the system in that way. And that's a huge challenge. And that's one, where we at Chatham House try from so many different angles to see if we can get a handle on it. But really, at the end of the day, one has to ask the question whether that's something that the Putin regime really wants, or whether they actually benefit from all the undermining of the international system that they're doing in all of these different aspects. And that's why they are unfortunately going to continue to do it.
Well, keep fighting that fight. And I mean, if you look back to the Cold War, one of my heroes, Ronald Wright, trust but verify. It gets even harder when we're looking in the cyber domain combined with nuclear. Let's go to some of the other solutions and strategies around cooperation you underscored in your report. anything there in terms of how national policies can be tailored to address the unique needs around of nuclear facilities and the like? Anything in particular there that you'd like to comment on? Because I think you did spend a lot of time coming up with some great ideas there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's two things in particular that I would like to point out. So one is around incident response planning, because I think that's something that's super important, and where we again see huge variability how that's implemented, even within one nation state, because sometimes you have the right intent at the national government level, but then, especially if incident response is something that might be devolved to local government, then it might also require the local government to have the awareness to give the impulse for that training. And so given that a lot of countries that rely on nuclear power might have nuclear reactors in lots of different locations, I mean, I guess in the US, this would probably all be at state level, right? So like that is something where you could potentially have a really different level of preparedness depending on how aware a local government is that this is something that they need to brief their first responders on. So ideally what we would see here is, and again, there are a lot of really good blueprints for how this could be done. So if a government wanted to do more on that, there's a lot out there to improve. But what you essentially would need to do is you would probably run, maybe once a year, maybe a few times a year, sort of training simulations where you simulate how first responders would respond if you have an incident at a nuclear facility. And so in this case, you probably, would want to go through a few different scenarios. So like a cyber attack, that's perhaps a ransomware attack, or I don't know, like the release of sensitive data, perhaps of employees, where you have staff members that might be worried for their safety and like what kind of recourse they have. And then, of course, you also need to game through what you would do if there was a radiation release. And I think this is where especially local first responders might have really different levels of preparedness. And it can really help to make sure that your local fire brigade, your local police have at least some like basic level of CBRN awareness and response, because if you are in that worst case scenario and they are unprepared or not sufficiently prepared, then that could really delay how you go about a quick response and how you go about helping people. So this is something that I really like because it brings together a lot of really different stakeholders that all play a big role in local security, national security. And it's also something where we have some really exemplary best practice examples, but they are just not implemented as widespread as I would like them to see.
And going back in time on some of the homeland issues and even nuclear specific, we always underscored we shouldn't be exchanging business cards when the bomb goes off on game day, when something bad happens. So the reality is just building some of the muscle connection between various entities is so essential, so critical, and we have major exercises in the U.S. that are done, tabletops and national tabletops around grid security and the like. But I do think making that real and just having an event and a reason to think about it before you really need to think about it is essential, I think. So thinking through some of the assumptions that you talked about, strategies, and President Eisenhower said, in preparation for battle, I've often found plans to be useless, but planning to be indispensable. So plans are going to change, and they do change based on first contact of an adversary. So we got to be thinking through that. Anything else you'd like to underscore in terms of some of the key takeaways?
Yeah, there's just one other recommendation that I'd really like to highlight, because I think it's really important, and that's again about the hopefully much wider spread of nuclear power that we're going to see over the next few years. When we were thinking about this and doing this analysis, we were thinking that we're already seeing huge differences in the readiness, in the capacity to ensure that you have good levels of cybersecurity in different states. And so a lot of the states that might actually really want to invest in small modular reactors or other types of more, like accessible nuclear power are the kind of states that might also actually struggle with their cybersecurity capacity. So something that is really important to do, and that could actually also be added on to, for example, the non-proliferation treaty regime, given that a huge part of that treaty is about ensuring access to peaceful uses technology, is making sure that the states that then acquire that kind of technology also have the cybersecurity capacity to keep that safe. And that's something that I've not seen a huge amount of attention on, but I think that's something that's going to become more and more important as nuclear power is, going to become so important to push towards net zero, and also to ensure that there is more energy security in states that really need it, where it could have a huge economic benefit and a huge development benefit to have access to nuclear power.
No, that's a great set of points. And back to, I mean, truth is we still play, we know it when we see it, but defining what an act of war is in cyber becomes very difficult. What are the bright lines?
Yep.
And what does that entail in a NATO context, Article 5 and the like, but obviously it has much bigger, broader implications. And I think it is pulling all the pieces together with at least an intent to move in the right direction, and don't underestimate just getting people fighting for the same fight, unifying around that mission, I think is so essential. Marion, just because I know we're coming up at the end of our time, what questions didn't I ask that I should have, either on the report or in general in terms of this critical theme around cyber and nuclear?
That's a really good question. This is honestly something that we also didn't do as much in the report as I hope we're going to do in future work, but I think there's so much more to be done around how AI might lower the barrier to entry for some cyber criminals, and what that then means for critical national infrastructure more broadly. Might have implications for nuclear, but I think it also has implications for other sectors, as we discussed earlier, like health, for example, where it could also have horrendous consequences, and where we also see a lot of health infrastructure having really outdated technology and therefore actually being quite vulnerable. So I think, there's obviously so much positive in changing technology and the advances we've made, but then there's also so much of commercial hacking tools available, commercial software tools available that actually lower the barrier to entry for criminal actors. And that could be something that spells out huge consequences for a lot of vulnerable sectors, in a way that we didn't explore as much in this report as I wish we had.
That's a great point, and there will be plenty of time, I think, to be thinking that issue through, because if you're not, we're potentially missing the boat, because the reality is it's not what we wish it to be. It's here. It's a double-edged sword, and you can also use it to enhance your resilience and your security, and let's hope that blue can outpace red in this particular fight. Or the defender, I would argue right now the initiative largely remains with the attacker, but I think AI does provide some opportunities to balance that and level some of that playing field. Marion, thank you so much for spending so much time with us today. Thank you for taking on this important work, and I'm thrilled you're doing that, and keep going, and hope to have you back soon sometime. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cyber Focus. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. Your ratings and reviews help us reach more listeners. Drop us a line if you have any ideas in terms of topics, themes, or individuals you'd like for us to host. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay curious.